We're going to start in Italy with the G7 meeting there. It seems like the leaders have reached an agreement on a new creative way to try and get more money into Ukraine, using money from interest on frozen Russian assets. So these pictures are from a couple of hours ago. You can see the back of Zelensky there meeting the world leaders. We believe there is a political agreement to use this new strategy, but details still to be worked out. Well, our diplomatic correspondent James Landale is there, and he explains the process the world leaders are grappling with to try and help Ukraine now.
That is the creative idea that the leaders are grappling with at the moment. They've got this windfall, if you like, of a very large pot of Russian assets that were frozen after the invasion of Ukraine. And they're sitting around mostly within EU financial institutions, earning lots of interest, but not being used. And they want to use that money to try and leverage some more cash for Ukraine. But it's complicated. There are a lot of technicalities, and at the moment we think they've probably got some kind of a political agreement behind it, but a lot more remains to be hammered out. Here's my report.
They call it a family photo, and like all the families, the G7 has its troubles. Many of these leaders are behind in the polls, facing tough elections, but they want to show the world they're still relevant while they're still here. One exception is their host, Italy's Prime Minister, whose party did well in the European elections. She said her summit would deliver concrete results on everything from migration to the wars in the Middle East and Ukraine.
The G7 is not a self-enclosed fortress which needs to defend itself against others. It is a container of values, and we want to open to the world in order to have shared development and growth.
Above all, the leaders came to this luxury resort to discuss a new plan to use frozen Russian assets to raise about $50 billion a year for Ukraine, using interest from the assets to pay off a long-term loan to Kyiv. But there are differences to hammer out. Some European leaders worry about disrupting financial markets, and they want the United States to take on more of the risk.
The logo of this summit is the olive tree. Now, of course, the olive branch is an ancient symbol of peace. But the leaders here are going to be talking mostly about war and how to lock in their financial support for Ukraine that they hope may outlast them.
One man who got perhaps a warmer welcome than he's used to at home was Rishi Sunak, taking time out from the election campaign to promise Ukraine almost £250 million to help rebuild its battered energy infrastructure. He'll also hold talks with Ukraine's President Zelensky, who'll be here later to try to get G7 leaders to give him more of what he needs. And that means security here on the southern Italian coast is especially tight for everyone attending the summit. Well, almost everyone.
So that idea of using Russian assets to raise cash for Ukraine sounds like an obvious thing to do, but it's not straightforward. There are a lot of complications. There are a lot of issues that are potentially quite divisive about it. And here to go through some of the detail of that, I'm very glad to be joined by the FT's Bureau Chief in Brussels, Henry Foy. Henry, welcome to the BBC. Let's go through some of those complications. There's some Russian cash. Why not use it to help support Ukraine?
Well, originally the plan was to use all of it, just to take the money that was there, frozen, about 190 billion euros of it held in Belgium, and just give it to Ukraine. Lots and lots of tension in Europe over that. What does it mean for the euro? Is it legal? Can we do it? And so the compromise, if you like, is to say, why don't we give a loan to Ukraine, $50 billion worth, now, and pay it off over the next 15 to 20 years with the income. It's at the moment that money's earning around 3 billion euros a year, so this is a way of getting that money to them quickly instead of drip feeding it out year by year, which is not as useful to Kyiv.
And are the Americans and the Europeans on the same page about where the risk should be borne?
this is the big question. It's what they've been agonizing over really for months, and I believe reached a deal very, very early this morning. Essentially, the Europeans are saying, look, instead of you taking out a loan and us giving you the money to pay it off, why don't we just issue the loan ourselves, backstopped by the EU budget? So if this money stops paying out or interest rates come down to a point where it doesn't earn any money, we'll pick up the tab. It's European money, so we should have the risk. If the Americans want to contribute their own loan, so be it.
If they agree a deal, how do you think the Russians will respond? Will it change any thinking in Moscow? You're a former bureau chief in Moscow. What's their thinking?
I mean, the Russians have been warning for the last 2.5 years, ever since these assets were immobilized, we're going to take your assets in exchange. They've started to do that. Corporate assets, companies like Carlsberg, etc., have had their assets in Russia taken away, expropriated and given to Putin's friends in Russia. So I think you'll see a lot of rhetoric after this summit, but in terms of what they can do, they'll just carry on what they're doing already. The Europeans have said, we don't accept you taking our corporate assets is the same as us taking yours, because you've broken international law, you've broken the UN Charter by invading Ukraine, so you can't say these two things are equal.
This is a slightly strange G7. Some of these leaders here might not be here next year at the next G7. How much is this an attempt by them to lock in financial support for Ukraine after they're gone, and perhaps when possibly, there might be another American president?
I think the US president is the really key one here. If you can get this loan issued now and start paying out at the end of the year, very, very difficult for a new administration to undo that, given it's going to be related to lenders, there's going to be credit in the markets. And so part of the idea today, in this summit, is to get this thing locked in, so if there is a change in occupancy in the White House, the money will still flow to Ukraine.
Henry Foy, Brussels Bureau Chief for the FT, thank you very, very much indeed. So as you can tell, a political agreement there may be for this idea to use Russian assets, but the devil is very much in the detail. And so a lot will depend on precisely what the leaders agree in the text of their communique that we'll get sometime in the next 24 hours.